might be in the form of a question.
So do we have to do something to pull the slides up on? Okay.
You have to join the.
Or do I do it online?
Yeah, you just join the thing. Yeah, you see the pre-flight testing, that thing?
I didn't see that.
No, wait, the previous tab you click. Yeah, where it says pre-flight test. Yeah, that thing. Yeah. Yeah. Continue. Just say no. Sure. That's it. Just say complete. Yeah. And that's it. And you can, I think it's this tab. This one? No, look above. Yeah.
Sure,
Yeah,
it's
that
not
thing. Yeah. That's it.
Sure.
Yeah, the first one.
Oh, you click that.
Yeah, that's it. Share.
Awesome.
Yes.
Thanks, man. That's how I control. So we just announced that we're going to give people a few minutes because it's after lunch.
Just start, like we have time, so just give it a couple of minutes and then start stuff. Yeah. Slide.
No, what slide? No, like the code of conduct or something.
That's what I feel.
That's funny. It's no, well, everything's captured. So. All right. Hi, everybody. It's a few minutes after 2, so I think we can probably go ahead and get started. After 1. Sorry, I'm not on California time, so blame it on that one. Yeah, so this is the BPF working group. My name is David Vernay. This is Suresh Krishnan. We're the co-chairs. All the technical advisors are in the room as well. Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So to first start off, NoteWell is in effect. So, you're agreeing to all the IETF processes and policies and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, NoteWell is in effect here. The code of conduct is of course also in effect. Please, treat everybody with respect. It's a collaborative environment. If you have technical disagreements, that's fine, but we all have the same goals. So let's try to, keep it civil, please. Yeah, so for administrative tasks, this is the Meet Echo link. If you want to join the Meet Echo link, you can do so to participate in chat and everything like that. We will need a volunteer for note takers. Can anybody help us take notes? Great.
It's a common point.
Okay. What do you think we should? Oh, thank you so much. Appreciate that. All right.
There is a link for the collaborative note taking. So if you can just dump whatever you can over there, that'll be good. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. So this is the agenda. I guess it didn't upload the latest one that I put on, but yeah. So we're doing the agenda bashing now. Then Dave Thaler is going to be going over the document logistics for the working group. Dave is then going to be talking about the instruction set specifications, so the ISA doc, which is kind of the first major effort that the working group has been undertaking. We're going to be talking about adopting the document, what else needs to be done, and what kind of the future of the document is. Will Hawkins is going to be talking about our ABI documentation for eBPF. After that, Dave is going to again be talking about the ELF documentation and for the working group as well. And then I don't think the slide is present right now on the version that's uploaded here, but I wanted to mention that you do not need to have extensive BPF experience or knowledge to participate, and of course to be here. Everybody's welcome, all ranges of experience, and BPF itself is a very large ecosystem, so no single human being exists on the planet that actually knows how all of it works anyway, so don't worry about that. All right, how do I change the next one?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Dave. I think a few words from our AD since this is our first meeting.
Yes, hello. I just wanted to say welcome to IETF117. Welcome to San Francisco. Welcome to the inaugural session of the BPF working group. We had a successful BOF in Yokohama, and the formation of this working group is the outcome of everybody's hard work. So thank you to everybody who made that possible. Yeah, we have, I think, lots of communities here. We got some kernel folks, and we got some IETF folks, some overlapping folks in the middle, and from other communities. And so, yes, thank you for your patience, helping spread the knowledge. I know also that there are kernel ways of working, and there's IETF ways of working, and we're gonna figure it out how this is gonna work. As Lorenzo told me yesterday, the best way to figure out a working style is to try to get work done. So we're gonna try to get work done. With that in mind, if this is the first time you're dropping into a BPF IETF session, like you didn't attend the BOF for the session in London, this is work basically kind of already in progress. There's history of the stuff in the kernel, and Dave has some document work that's been going on for a while. So we're kind of try to get a jump straight out of the gate. So with that, I will say thank you to our chairs for agreeing to serve and turn it over to you guys. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Eric. All right, so yeah, without further ado, Dave, do you want to take us away with the document logistics? How do you change the next one?
Okay, so this first presentation isn't about a specific document, it's about how the two communities work together. So I'll wait for the docs to come up. And I will use the ISA document as an example, but this isn't just about the ISA document. All right, so yeah, I'm Dave Thaler. Next slide. Okay. Good, next slide.
It is updated here. It's not updated there yet. It's coming.
So first I want to show how the existing ISA document is generated today. Okay, now it can change or whatever, we can change the process, but if the slide, there it is. Okay, here we go. All right, so today that this works, and this is different from last IETF because we made some changes to do the things that we talked about last IETF in the side meeting that happened after the BOF. And so here's how it works today. So the very left side shows what happens in the Linux kernel repository. And so there's a set of files that get used to create the internet draft. And so by core files, we're talking about the ones that actually have the actual instructions, the actual behavior in it, right? The actual content, if you will, is what I mean by a core file. So that gets done today by a submission going to a mailing list that's cross-posted between BPF at VJR, that's the current Linux kernel mailing list, for BPF, and the BPF at IETF.org, which is the working group mailing list, right? We once tried to have one be a member of the other, and we ran into some weird mailman issues. And so right now we just say, please cross-post stuff to both lists until we get that worked out. Okay, and so if there's a submission that says, here's what the document should be, here's a change that's proposed or whatever, then that gets cross-posted to both mailing lists. And then it gets merged after discussion. It finally gets merged into the Linux tree in the BPF next branch. Okay. And so now you have like an RST file that's sitting there in the Linux kernel repository that's gone through review and been checked in and is sitting there in the Git repository. Meanwhile, what happens is there's another GitHub repository. This one, there is a GitHub repository that's the working group repository. You can see github.com/IETF-WG-BPF, right? That's the GitHub organization for this working group that was created. Okay. Underneath that repository, there is underneath that organization, there's a repository that contains a mirror of the files on the left, right? So those are exact copy, right? Those files that are IRC files get copied over into this other repository in GitHub. The GitHub also has additional files in it right now. That's the boilerplate, right? The things that actually creates the header and the footer and the acknowledgement section and so on. So I'll talk about that. And so right now that's the boilerplate file. So if somebody makes a change to the boilerplate files, that's not currently in the Linux kernel repository. That's over there in GitHub, right? So there's two different submission processes for different files. Again, this is current state today, okay? Not necessarily what it should be, just saying this is what happened for the draft that's out there now, okay? And so if somebody wants to create a change to the boilerplate, like I was doing, then there's a GitHub fork or branch, and you submit that to the GitHub process. But you're only supposed to touch the boilerplate files that way. And so the main branch in the GitHub working group repository has files mirrored from the kernel one, right? Which is like instruction set.rst. And there's the boilerplate files like the skeleton, okay? And then what happens is every time that there's a push to that repository, okay, the GitHub CI/CD runs and it generates an internet draft from that collection of files. And it takes the internet draft version and it checks it into a separate branch there. So there's a generated branch, right? The name of the branch is generated, and that has the actual, HTML and TXT and XML files that would be in the internet draft. And so that's, if you want to say, what would it look like in the internet draft format, you can go and look there, just like, Martin Thompson's tools, you can do diffs and stuff. And so you can see what's the diffs between the editor's copy and the last copy submitted to IETF in the data tracker. So finally, at a particular point, like close to the ID deadline, right, then I took a snapshot and just submitted exactly what was out of that tree. Okay. So if I wanted to change instruction set.rst, I start on the left side. It then shows up in the mirror, and then shows up derived in there. And all the other ones, right, the mirroring and the ID submission is just, process with no like human changes in between, right? So that's the process that works today, right? So all the actual technical changes happen cross-posted and checked in through the Linux kernel tree. And the packaging happens in GitHub and is not in the Linux kernel tree right now, okay? All right. Now, people have opinions as to what it should be in the future. I'm happy to hear that. This is just me saying what the current process is for the document that exists today. Okay. All right. So just to drill down into what the files are. So this is the file that's the draft Thaler BPF ISA 01, right? Which I am listed as an editor because, right, I didn't author instruction set RST. That's the rest of the community that the acknowledgement section talks about. I just created the packaging around it, right? And so core files for that document, right, is instruction set.rst. And there's a separate file that's today only in GitHub, which is the instruction set skeleton. That's what has the header, the footer, and the acknowledgement section, things like that, okay? Things that only appear that are relevant to internet drafts. And then there's the INA consideration section that we will talk about in a later presentation that's on the agenda. And so we'll get back to that one, and that one is in instruction set opcodes. It's currently in GitHub, okay? So if you got comments on that one, wait for the presentation. But the point is, right now there's exactly 3 files, and the skeleton includes the other 2 and generates the internet draft. Okay, so that's how it's organized right now. And instruction set.rst is in a directory that I'll talk about on a later slide. Next. Okay, so when we look in the Linux kernel tree, so that was kind of the view of the middle tier of the first slide. So this is the left tier. If we look back in the Linux kernel tree, it looks like this, right? Under the Linux kernel tree, there's documentation, BPF, standardization, right? So David created this, like a month ago or something like that.
Yeah,
okay?
something like that.
Anything that is intended for standardization is supposed to go here. And whether it's the right set of files, but you can see this is where instruction set.rst lives. That's the one that gets mirrored to GitHub, among other files, okay? And so then we look inside index.rst. So now we look at that one. Next. Okay. So last IETF and even before that, there was questions about how do we label things so people know that if they're going to submit a patch to the Linux kernel tree, they know that it's covered by the IETF note well. How would you know that? Okay. And so this is the initial notice that's there, right? We can rev it, put more stuff under there. But the point is you're putting it in a directory and the whole directory is labeled this way. Okay. So you better notice this, right? And it says, and we can put other stuff here that we want to. So there's a link to the data tracker and so on. So this is where any notices about what you're expected to understand and do that apply to this entire directory go here. This is not in the internet draft. This is notices in the Linux kernel repository that says all this is under, everything, all the files are in here are under the or BSD2 clause, etc. Okay. So this was the resolution that I think David was pointing on this part, and I'm just presenting, yeah, we're just following this. This is where instruction set.rst is being copied from. Okay. And so if there's no problems with this, and the proposal is this is the document logistics as to how we work, whatever. If people have amendments, then we can do that. Okay. All right. And so now, process for contributing patches. And so we need to make sure people understand the IPR rules. And so there's already kind of a rule that says, well, you shouldn't be copying any existing code into such documents, right? The reviewers would reject such a thing, right? You can't put code in there. You put documentation and stuff in there, but you can't put code, right? So that's the job of the reviewers, and there isn't code in there right now. And the job of the reviewers, since it's cross-posted to both lists and so on, and to make sure that there isn't any code that shows up in there, okay? But this notion that says, how do I know if every submitter has adhered to both of the rules? And that index file is at least a placeholder as a start for it. We can keep adding to that if there's other things that we think that they need to know. That index.rst is where to put the answers to this. Okay. So then the question is, okay, so you've got some patch that's out there. It's cross-posted on both lists. Okay. So logistics question, first one to answer is, who has to act a patch before it gets merged? Okay. Who has the ability to say, this thing is good? Okay. Proposal might be, whatever you think the answer is, designate them as one of the internet draft editors, okay? doesn't have to be me, right? It could be any one of the other people in this room. If you think that's the right person or a set of people to act a patch, my proposal is list them as an editor of the document because they have editing permission over what's get merged, right? It's kind of the definition of an editor in my view, okay? So that's my proposal, as to whoever you're going to say has to act a patch. As kind of, other people can act it, but who's the minimum set that at least one of these people have to act it? Take them and list that set of people as editors of the document, okay? And again, whether I don't care if I'm one of them. I'm just saying that's the process that I'm proposing. And then who could knack a patch and prevent merging, right? Somebody comments on it and to say, what would prevent it from being merged? Okay, and I don't have a good answer to that one, if there is one. So interested in opinions on that. But at least that's my proposal for the who has to act, is pick an answer and then list that set of people as editors. Okay. Then in IETF documents, there's always a discussion about editors, authors, contributors, and acknowledgements. Like who goes in what section? Do you actually have all of those sections, or is only a subset of those relevant, and so on. So if you're new to the IETF process, a definition of those is, there's different definitions, right? One definition of editor is somebody that just manages what is in there, but doesn't actually have to write text. And so here, somebody that manages the internet draft conversion process. Like what I was doing is I was making it show up as an internet draft and the formatting and so on. I said that would be an editor role. An author role would be somebody who writes a significant portion of text, for some definition of significant portion of text. In an IETF, there's a convention that you're supposed to have like at most 5 people in the authors list. It's not a hard rule, but you better have a good reason if it's more than 5, because people will give you a hard time if it's more than 5. Okay. Contributor, some documents have a contributor section where their names and stuff get listed, and some documents don't have such a thing. So this might be, if you contribute a patch that's accepted, are you a contributor or an acknowledgement? Okay, and the answer is that depends on the working group and what process you want, right? There's no hard and fast rule. And in the acknowledgement section, which you don't have to have one, okay, if somebody reviews a patch and they suggest changes, but they didn't author a patch, are they acknowledged or what? So there's some open questions there. If you look at what I did in the ISA document right now, everybody that contributed a patch itself is in the acknowledgement section. Now, whether that's right or wrong, I'm saying that's what I did. And so I don't have a contributor section. And when I have an editor and I have a set of acknowledgement people.
One thing that may be worth considering is on the Linux kernel side, people that act patches, it's like a verb, right? Those maybe belong in the acknowledge section.
Yep.
If you review it and you actually get
Absolutely.
an act by tag, whereas the contributor is somebody that submitted a patch. So
yeah,
the author and the editor it doesn't really map very well, I think, but the contributor and acknowledge, I think, does map naturally.
So if we have a way that we want to work, then we should agree on that as whatever the precedent is as we start to have a bunch of these documents here, right? Because I'm happy to change to be whatever. That's why I'm asking these questions here. Because it's not a working group document yet, but once it's a working group document, we should have a precedent and kind of a rule of thumb that we want documents to use. Okay. So I'm just using myself as an example here because we want there to be a bunch of documents with multiple authors and things. So I heard, David, you said, just on that one, just to close on that one, you said you think if you act something, then you think that is something to be acknowledged, or
I think so, right? I mean, there's some overlap even in the term. I think so, especially because often their contributions are mirrored in the form of suggestions and nits and stuff like that.
Yeah. If we can, since when I did it, it was a lot easier to retroactively go back and find everybody that contributed stuff, because you can look at the Git history of everybody that was one of the authors of stuff.
Yeah.
Trying to come up with a list of acts retroactively was a lot harder, so I haven't done that yet.
Yeah.
You probably could with a bunch of tooling, but
I mean, obviously all of the acts are retained because it's all just in the Git history.
Right,
but it's more of a pain.
Yeah. But it can be done. It's just I haven't done that step. So
So
about going forward, it's easy to do stuff forward.
Yeah. So okay. So just throwing up an idea here, Suresh Krishnan. So like we start with the clean slate once the document becomes a working group doc, and we start keeping track instead of going back. I think that could be a good bet because that's the first document under the working group, right? Like, and then we can kind of keep the process going forward, not necessarily to go back to that point, but we can discuss that. Lars, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Hey, Lars Eggert. I just want to sort of maybe tell you what we did in Quick, just for consideration, right? So, and this is also like only for the base documents. I don't know what Quick's doing now because I'm not a chair anymore there. So we didn't have authors, at least not for working group documents. We basically, as the chairs, we assigned editors. We also didn't have contributors. We only basically had a pretty long acknowledgement section that was automatically generated from anybody who had left a comment on a GitHub issue that made it into the document. So it was pretty lenient, right? And everybody was sort of, so we were very GitHub focused, so that worked for us. And I think there was 1 or 2 people that we added manually because, you know, they would just send email. And the way, I think I peeked at your next slide. So we basically as chairs were the ones that ran the GitHub process. So we were basically triaging the issues on a weekly call. And we basically said to the editors, you know, has consensus and you can close it and you can merge it. And the editors basically did that. And there was a bunch of editorial work, the text that they did on their own, but anything technical was sort of triaged that way in sort of by the chairs with the editors and the working group. And that worked pretty well for us. I don't know if it's going to work well for you, but you know, it's a consideration that you might want to have.
Okay, thanks, Lars. So this next slide is not a statement about current state. This is just me throwing out a proposal to get discussion. Okay, so this is, we've been in a number of, or at least I've been in other working groups with issues, and somebody will raise an issue on the list and nobody will respond to it, and then everybody forgets about it. Okay, and so this is not to say that you have to use, track every issue. What it means is that a issue tracker is useful to not forget things that have been raised. Because how do you know that you have consensus if consensus is really supposed to be about if all issues have been addressed, but not necessarily accommodated, right? So how do you know that? And at least having an issue tracker that helps you keep track of, gee, nobody's gotten around to submitting the patch for this one yet, but everybody agreed it needed to be fixed. And did we forget about that? And there's a bunch of mails on the list on the mailing list, and a lot of those 100 mails, which one of those actually raised an issue, right? And so that's the argument that says having a set of issues tracked, not that all issues have to be tracked this way, because if somebody raises an issue and submits a patch in the same email, why bother, right? But having that was useful. And so my proposal is, now that we have an IETF GitHub repository, that unless there's another alternative, I like, and we've done that in a number of other working groups, is just use the GitHub repository that the document is in as a place to track issues, such that, you know, chairs and authors can easily look up what are the things that I still need somebody to address. Okay. And so that is a proposal. And for the working groups that done that, I've seen at least 3 different ways that working groups have used for who gets to close those issues, right? I've seen one working group that says the issue is closed as soon as the patch is merged. I've seen another working group that says the issue stays open until the internet draft submission. That was that last right line on the first diagram. When it shows up in the data tracker, then I'll close it. And until then, it's a reminder that I still got to submit an internet draft, right? I've seen a working group that does that. And by the way, the one that I'm the chair on right now uses B. And the third one is when the chairs verify consensus on the results, right? Because, you know, after it goes through any objections on the list, nobody raised it, then the chair will say, yes, I agree, you've done what the working group said, and I'll close it that way. And a working group that's TEEP that I'm an author in uses that one, right? So I've done all 3 of these in different working groups. So, all right.
Lars Eckert again. So again, for what we did in Quick is that we actually sort of used issues in the working group to figure out whether a text change was needed. And so basically we would not take PRs without there being an issue that the working group had decided it's an issue that requires text changes. And when we did, then we basically, so we always had a link between an open issue and a PR. And we also had the model that whatever the editor copy was on GitHub at the time had only PRs landed in it that had gotten working group consensus. So you could basically assume that what you were reading there as the editor's copy was the agreed on state of the document. For the most part, we had some outliers where we weren't quite sure which option we were going to pick, and so we implemented one and then the other, or so on and so forth. And then occasionally, just to reconfirm, we said on this particular version of the draft, let's do like a last call in the group, not a working group last call, just basically a affirmation that everybody really agrees that we have consensus on this thing. And that was sort of important because we had parallel implementations and nobody wanted to, like, you know, undo things based on an editor copy. And that worked pretty well for us again.
Thanks, Lars. Christoph?
Yeah, Christoph Helvigs. Let's turn this on first.
I think it's on. You just have to get closer.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, Christoph Helvig.
You're just tall enough that I can't hear you.
I find the usage of things like GitHub issues or pull requests extremely questionable. It's a service that requires an account that has a very questionable privacy and usage policy. And there's people, including me, who would refuse to use that. And driving an open standard through these kinds of services is a very bad idea.
I
This
didn't-
this does not apply
Mhm.
to just using it as just a Git server because
Mhm.
you don't require an account for that, like all other Git hosting.
I will only comment there that I've seen two different ways that working groups use GitHub repositories. One is more like Lars said, where the working group participants are supposed to use the Git repository. The other way that I've seen working groups use it is doesn't matter whether contributors do or not, the chairs do. And so if somebody files something on the list and it's not being tracked, then the chairs will go and file an issue, and it's a chair resource, right? So
Yeah, I mean, this is basically what we've been doing for a lot of the
Yeah,
drafts in the NFS4 working group, where it's not even a working group policy, but a decision by the editors that just about everyone's maintaining it in a Git repository. And a lot of people, being Linux people, they host it not on GitHub but elsewhere. But it's basically a way to structure the document and have a version control history.
Yeah, so I think like from the chair perspective, I don't think this is going to be exclusionary for anybody. So like, we'll find a way to make this work, because there's other reasons not to use GitHub. Like one of them being it doesn't support V6, which is the protocol, and we have a bug like what for like 5 years. So I think like we get exactly what you say. We'll figure out a way to do this. Like, but I think Dave's point is we need to have a place where everybody gets to, where the issues can be tracked and not dropped in the ground. I think that's like the key point. Thanks.
Watson Lad Akamai. My one question is, you talk about when a patch is merged, or that could happen from two different places. So the native support for linking the merging of a PR to the closing of an issue is going to have to deal with the fact that that patch could have come in on the Linux kernel side. And also, once you start getting people thinking, okay, I'm going to open a pull request in GitHub, now you have to make the patches flow back. So it might be you might have to handhold people and get them to point their patches in the right place.
yeah, both are good points. And the first one, when I authored this slide, what I was thinking on A was that when it was merged in the Linux kernel repository, as opposed to when it showed up in the mirror. That's what I was thinking. But you're right. There's actually two possibilities there, right? You could say, well, an intermediate one is I close it when it shows up in the mirror, right? Which is after it gets checked in the Linux kernel repository. That's not what I was thinking, but that's the first part of your question. And then you had a second point, and I've not forgotten what it was. You have to remind me. I had to comment on that one too.
People will think that they should open a PR.
Oh yeah, you're right. Thank you. Okay. Today, there's no backflow, right? That's because you never check in anything into GitHub that actually shows up in the Linux kernel repository. So there's never anything to copy backwards. If we moved a file from GitHub, let's say we moved instruction set opcodes over into the Linux kernel repository, then you never check it into GitHub, right? You'd never do a GitHub pull request, right? You only do a GitHub pull request for the mirroring itself. The mirroring process does that, or for any file that's only in GitHub. So that's what I was going to comment on.
Lars, I had a question for you actually. Like one of the questions is, who closed the issues? Like in Quick, was it the editors or the chairs who closed the issue to verify it's closed?
I think it was the chairs. I can't quite remember because I'm old. But I think it was the chairs after the PRs landed.
Okay, I think like we would appreciate some input on that, because I think both of them can work.
Yeah, I would say I've done RATS uses A and TEEP uses B. Sorry, TEEP uses C. Yeah. So anyway, I've been authors of documents and working groups use all three of these. So I wouldn't say any one of these is particularly recommended. So
thank you.
So I actually got in line to talk about Christoph's issue, right, with GitHub, because we had that raised in Quick as well. And one thing we did is we actually set up a separate IETF mailing list that was basically the owner account of the working group. And so it was automatically subscribed to all issues and all PRs. And so all the discussion went by email to that list.
Yep.
And even without a GitHub user ID, you could reply to those issue emails and it would show up in GitHub as well. That wasn't a super great experience for the people that chose that route, because I think there were like tens of thousands of emails on that list over the, I mean, we had 5,000 issues and I think 3,000 PRs, right? So, but it did work, right? And also it's important for sort of transparency and archival of the process to have that record on the IETF side about what was actually sort of happening in the GitHub discussions. In the off chance that it ever goes under, it goes bankrupt, or whatever.
Right. That's another.
Yeah.
Plus
So
one of
that
that,
I encourage you to set this up, and it's not super obvious, but it's doable and it's helpful. But yeah, so if you have a significant constituency that doesn't want to use GitHub, you can't probably do what the Quick working group did, and you need to find some other way.
Yeah, my impression is that what Quick did is not going to work well for the Linux community, but I think what you mentioned about like if there is something that shows up and say somebody comments on a GitHub issue, right? Then yes, you can subscribe the mailing list to that, and I suspect that the traffic will be far lower than the Quick traffic. So I think it'll be largely. I mean, and I've seen other places that have done exactly what you said, right? As the mailing list gets subscribed and the watch list for the GitHub repository. So if somebody comments there instead of on the list like they were supposed to, it still goes to the list.
I think, Dave, there's like a slight difference. It's not the list itself, but it's a separate list, if I remember correctly.
With a
Right,
quick
Ras?
issues
Quick it
list, that was an IETF
because of
list,
volume.
but that was I set it up so that you couldn't actually post to it unless you were GitHub. You could reply, but the IETF list dropped that email, but it showed up on the GitHub issue tracker, and then from GitHub it got pushed again to the mailing list. So,
I mean, the real question is, I mean, why do we? I mean, I guess I know Dave does it because he's used to it, but in general, large parts of the IETF don't really do GitHub processes. The Linux community doesn't do it at all. Why do we want to do it for this cross section of two communities that usually have a different process?
I proposed it because I wanted an issue tracker, and if you have an alternative issue tracker, I'm happy to say that's another proposal here. The meta point is to have an issue tracker.
Yeah,
okay, and we've got a repository that has an issue tracker, so we could use that one, or we could use a different one if you have another one you're going to point to. I just want one.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that because all the patches are going through the kernel tree, we don't need something like Bitbucket or GitHub, right? We need an issue tracker. We could use Atlassian, you could use GitLab, you could really use anything.
Correct,
so
correct.
I think
having one is the main point.
Yeah, we just need a way that somebody who raises an objection over email doesn't have their objection fall into the ether, like what often happens with the Linux kernel.
Correct. So if you want to propose one of those other ones, we can update the slide that says, okay, we could use IETF, GitHub repository, we could use Atlassian, whatever it is. As long as we agree on which one it is, that's all I want. Working group, you pick one.
I guess is kind of a bit getting into a meta discussion. We should probably take back to the IETF.
I'd like to get on to the actual technical discussion, but this is one
probably,
that we got to have this discussion once, right?
But I mean, I guess this is probably a bit of a generic problem in IETF, that the whole concept of having an issue tracker that goes beyond the errata tracker for a working group would probably be a very good thing for many working groups.
Because errata only applies to RSCs, and we don't have any of those.
No, that's what I mean. An issue tracker that goes beyond the errata tracker.
Yeah, an issue tracker for internet drafts. Yeah.
Yeah, so we do have something like that. That's like kind of like bespoke stuff done for us. There's like a track instance that we have and we can use. Like, so we can probably explore that after. But I think is the usability of that is not as good as a GitHub issue tracker. So as long as we are okay with the compromise we are making, I'm totally fine, right? Like either way, right? But there does exist something that we can probably talk about in a bit. I have done this. It's incredibly wonky, but it can work. Yeah.
I mean, the one interesting thing, and this is kind of getting into a lot of hand waving because no one's done it. One of the interesting things that happened in Linux infrastructure is the idea of that you have trackers based on email commands. Like it started in Linux with sysbot, the fuss tester, and now we have the regression testing bot, where you literally have the magic commands in the email, kind of like the Debian bug tracking system works for people who know that. And that's very interesting because it falls into the email-based workflow. A lot of IETF does and a lot of Linux does, but it also means someone has to set it up, and I don't know who that would be. So this is the hand-wavy part, which is why I just want to briefly mention it.
Lars Eckert again. So just to comment in general, so the IETF has basically some pretty lightweight requirements, right? Sort of participants must be able to follow the work, right? So it must be transparent. I think that is given on GitHub, even without a login, because you can actually read the issues and look at stuff. You can't comment without a login, right? But contributions to the IETF typically get made on mailing lists, and that is always available. And as long as it's up to the chairs then, right, to make sure that issues that get raised by mail make it into whatever system is being used to track those issues. And lots of working groups never do anything other than mail, which doesn't scale super well. So with Quick, we actually really liked the ability to be sure that we had actually closed all the issues that were open and felt confident that nothing got lost. That was nice. I don't know how many issues you expect, but that was compared to some other working groups that I was involved in, that was actually a nice feature. But as long as you pick a way that works for you, that has the transparency that the IETF wants, and you can sort of manage the process such that email contributions are treated as the same as any other contribution, I think you're fine.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is I've not heard anybody arguing against having an issue tracker to begin with. And since this one is not a technical thing, it's not going to show up as an RFC. I think the chair should just decide and tell us the way that they want the working group to work, right? I mean, you've heard the input from the community now. It's not something that we have to, have IETF-wide consensus on or something like that. I think you guys should just tell us. Okay. All right. Okay. I think we should go on now. All right, that's all on the document logistics. Any other document logistics before we get into actual document stuff? Okay, thanks. What's up next? Instruction set, okay. All right, I guess it's me too. All right, so this is currently an individual submission, but I think the goal is to adopt it as a working group document, or at least do that call or whatever. So the chairs will do that at the end here. But first, I wanted to talk about just give an overview, since this is an individual submission. But again, I am not an author. Well, I guess I'm an author because I've generated a patch or two. But I am the editor right now that I just did the transform in internet draft format. Okay. So the working group charter says this, right? We're tasked with creating a clear process for extensions. Okay. And that's the part that I'm going to focus on right now, because most of the document is just talking about here's factually what is actually implemented and people use as their reference, right? Just now in internet draft format. But the working group charter says we're supposed to create a process for extensions. And so I started this thread last month or whatever. That's that title you can find on the list, instruction set extension policy, that says for extending the instruction set document, we haven't written that down. And so we started this thread and I said, well, here's some proposed text to go in the INA consideration section, which if you look at the document right now that's posted in the internet draft repository, it doesn't have an INA consideration section. The copy that I have that's like the editor's copy has a pull request open with the text that I posted on the list. And I want to get some discussion about that right now to say, what should it look like by the time it gets merged? So let's talk about that. Let's say you want to add new instructions. Let's talk about things. Next slide. All right. So now I'm basically going to present what was in that thread, since there's only a small number of people commenting on it. So like I was on there and Alexi was on there and a lot of people were silent. So if you weren't watching it, then here's the discussion. Okay. So first point is that when somebody adds new instructions in the future, so let's say we have an RFC and then somebody wants to add some new instructions, what happens? Okay. The first thing that we say is the recommendation is don't rev the existing RFC to add new instructions. You add an extension RFC that says, here's the RFC, the BPF instructions for blah, and you put those in a separate document, and you say, here's the, opcodes and things that are in use for this one right here, and you specify the behavior, but you don't rev the other one, okay? And because the code points are a new set of code points, you don't even have to use the updates keyword, right? Which updates is a little bit ambiguous in IETF sense as to what updates exactly means. But here my proposal is we don't use updates, we don't use obsoletes or whatever. You just say, here's an extension document and here's the code points that have been assigned for it, okay? And so then that just means any new set comes as a standalone document. We don't have to keep generating a brand new version of the same document over and over, okay? But we also don't want to make the additions necessarily, gee, you can't implement those in the Linux kernel until there's an RFC. No, that's not what we want either, right? We want some process that unblocks implementers, okay, without having to wait for an RFC, but still encourages them to have an RFC for things we want to be cross-platform, right? So that's the goal, okay? So the proposal for that is to say we want to allow a way of referencing something other than an RFC in the meantime to get code points. There's plenty of ways to do that, okay? But the proposal is, yes, you can check stuff into Linux as long as you have the stuff that's in, the Linux kernel repository, you got a document there that talks about it or someplace else, then you can do it, okay? So that's the proposal, and the rest is how you do that, but this is the intent, okay? The intent is, yes, if you want to create your own SmartDict with a couple of fancy instructions for your SmartDict, there is a way for you to do that, okay? We don't want to block you, and all the rest of the presentation is about how and what the rules might be for allowing somebody to do that sort of stuff, while still having the community feel good about it.
So those are code points that live in an IANA registry?
Hold that thought, because that's one of the next slides.
All right, I'm holding.
It's living in a registry, and we'll come to that. So next slide, please. All right, so thank you, Lars. So you should stay up with the mics. The first question is, should that registry be on IANA or not? Yes, I've got a plant in the audience, apparently. All right, so should the registry just be an IANA registry, or should it just be files in the Linux kernel tree? Okay, top branch, because a lot of things fall out of this decision here, right? The policy for allocation, like who can do stuff, what the prereqs are, is mostly orthogonal to this, right? Where is the list that you're going to point people to, right? Because what we want is we want the original RFC that says, here's the instruction set to say, if you want to do an extension, here's where you go. Here's the process. The under consideration section, whatever it is, says you should go here, whether it's IANA or not. Here's the process for doing an extension. Here's where you post stuff to get review, or here's where you look to see what the code points mean. If you get a file that has these weird things in it, where do you go and you look for the references and so on. So do you look for a file? Is that pointer somewhere in the Linux kernel tree, or is it at IANA? Those are the two obvious answers. Okay. So now if you have a comment on A versus B, now is the appropriate time to raise your opinions on that.
Lars, I'm glad I stayed in line. So if we put it in the Linux kernel tree or somewhere else, and you want to refer to it from an RFC, there's this thing called a normative reference, and it would need to be one of those. And pointing to some random file on some web page is requires special ISG approval, because typically we point to like other standards normatively or other stable documents, right? So it can be done. It's maybe a little painful. I would personally like to see like a really good reason to do so, because it is possible, but it's a little bit unusual. If we did it with IANA, that's like the normal way the IETF does this. And there's actually a process defined called early allocation of IANA code points, where a working group chair, I think is the process says, can go to IANA and can say, we have an adopted document that isn't ready yet, but it's going to need code points and people want to implement. I want an early allocation in that registry, and that gets then put in there. And eventually, you know, when it gets an RFC, that code point doesn't change. So if that, if you haven't looked at that process yet, I encourage you to figure out whether it works for you, because it would fit better with the overall IETF model. But since this is kind of a special hybrid snowflake working group, right, I agree we might need to have creative solutions here. Thank you.
Thanks, Lars.
Yeah, Christoph Helvig. So I agree with Lars, right? I mean, the one reason why I started kicking this whole thing off is because for NVMe, we needed a normative reference, and the commit ID in the kernel doesn't cut it. So indirectly going back to that will kind of defeat the whole process. And IANA really does its job well. We shouldn't interact with them all that often, because we really shouldn't be adding code points all the time. I mean, yes, eventually we will, and having a proper process to go through, which isn't actually all that extensive, is a good thing. And IANA knows how to keep registries. We don't. It's not our main job. So I'm all in favor for A.
Okay, thank you.
Dave.
Hi, David Bernay, chair hat off for a moment. So the big question for whether I think IANA would be viable is whether two things. One is whether they could accommodate a tree style of instruction encodings. It's not just 8-byte encodings where everything is the same. You have opcodes that inform different types of instructions depending on what the opcode is for the rest of the encoding. It's more similar to x86 than something like ARM. But apparently IANA can have, I think an expert is either on the way.
Teaser update, upcoming slides. Dave's giving a teaser on upcoming slides.
IANA people are in the room.
Oh, well, hello. So I'll let them discuss that. And my understanding is that it is possible. But the other part is whether what's the process with ensuring that new instructions and new encodings added to IANA are approved by the experts or approved by the working group. And my understanding is also that we can accommodate that according to how we structure it in the RFC. So I tend to agree. IANA is kind of a no-brainer normative reference. My understanding is the overhead is very minimal, and it's probably going to cause less confusion and less overhead than having something in the Linux kernel tree. So that's my 2 cents.
Yeah, thank you. And also one more thing, David, right? There might be some stuff that's simply first come, first serve, and that's also something we can set up, right? Like, you know, it might be very little, but
I'm just commenting, people are diving into policy stuff, which is future slides. I'm trying to keep the policy discussion separate from the location discussion, because I believe they're orthogonal. You may not be convinced of that, but hopefully you will be by the time we cover both. So,
go ahead.
Eric Klein, do you have an example of what an IANA registry might look like?
Yes.
For some sample stuff?
Yes.
Okay. because we have some
See you later
IONA
slides.
people, IONA people here in the room,
Yeah.
and they pointed me at some other
Okay.
registries that I sent to
All right.
Suresh.
So I'm going to go forward in the slides unless I see anybody else after Eric come up. I'm going to use IANA in my verbal examples, assuming that the answer is IANA. But just keep in mind through all the rest of the slides, there would be a non-IANA version that I could equally use a different voiceover for all the rest of the slides. So, okay. But I'm going to assume IANA, and so if I keep saying IANA, it's because that's what I'm hearing so far. All right. So if you look at 8126, which is the RFC that says what you put in your IANA consideration section, there's a bunch of different subsections there that you can use as IANA policies around any registry you give, right? So you define a registry and you tell IANA, here's the instructions for how to maintain that registry, right? And so here's their list of common menu of things that they're told for different registries, right? And so some of them can be combined, that you could have, different code point areas that use different policies. Some of these can be combined, like you could have a private use section, a non-private use section, and for the non-private use section, and some of the other ones are a menu. But for everything from like first come, first serve down to IESG approval, it's like for a particular range of code points, okay, you typically pick one of these, and these are roughly in order of most from least strict to most strict. Maybe IESG approval is not quite, but from first come, first serve down to standards action, they're an increasing order of strictness. Okay. And so typically you'd pick a registry when defining it, and you typically pick one or more of those. Okay. And so I'm going to assume that we're going to do that. But there might be variations, and if you want some special thing, you could do this with a tweak or whatever, that's okay. Okay. So next slide. So another precedent that I would show that I'm going to argue is relevant for part of this, because I remember I'm going to go back to that point that says somebody wants to add a new instruction, or they have to wait for an RFC. Okay, and says, can I do this like for me or for my SmartNIC or whatever? And can I do it in the meantime and get some early allocation or provisional allocation or whatever? So I was also involved with the documenting the process for URI schemes that existed before me, and so there some code points, you split the space. You say, well, this space, this range of values has this policy, and this range of values has that policy. URI schemes is an example that doesn't do that. Okay, it's all one master range, but each entry in there has a label as to is it permanent, provisional, or historical. Okay, so you could say for any particular instruction in the instruction set, is it permanent, provisional, or historical, right? If you had a different code point space, that means once you standardize it, you'd have to change like the opcode or change some other entry in there, and that would affect implementations, and that's why I don't want to do that. Okay, and so if you put this label on there, then you can put different policies for different labels, and so it's not a range that was just a weird label on the table, right? It says permanent. URI schemes, they use a different registration procedure, a different criteria for different labels, right? So in their example, which I don't think is correct for us, right? But in their example, first come, first serve, you can get something because there's an infinite number of strings, right? But you got to have expert review to have permanent, okay? They don't divide by category, okay? And in fact, it actually, the document, I think there's a typo there, 8124-26, it's that same RFC. I got a typo in one of my two slides. It says, if your registry does not have a practical limit on code points, perhaps adding the option for provisional registrations might be right for that registry as well. I'm going to argue that that's probably a good idea for us to maybe follow this as the recommendation, that perhaps adding might be right. Okay, go ahead.
I think Michael, Tom was ahead of you,
Oh, okay.
but he didn't join the line, so I'll let
Okay.
Tom go first. But Tom joined the line next time. Thank you.
If you want to see the full details, you could have read anybody else that's waiting out there in line, read the thread on the mailing list, and you'll see the actual proposed text. So go ahead.
Tom, go ahead. I'll go, Michael.
Clarifying question. So in this context, I assume code point really means opcode number or something else?
It's more than just opcode. That's what David was getting at when it's hierarchical, because there's opcode, there's the source value, there's the IMM value and offset value depending on the instruction. So we'll see that in the examples later. It's a set of things. Yeah.
Thank you.
But you can think of it as just opcode. If you think of it as just opcode, you'll ask all the right questions anyway.
Michael, go ahead.
Hi, Dave. So one concern I have with these different with this is that there is a situation where long-term kernels get backports of things, and particularly I can imagine situations where a new opcode is created because we have a security concern that we want to patch back and we want to use the newest thing. And I don't know if I think that there needs to be perhaps another category, which is somewhere between permanent and provisional, that essentially means long-term release. The number might change upstream, but that it's not going to change in this branch, and that when this branch goes away, all those opcodes essentially disappear. And it's some kind of space in between. And I don't know how to express it well, but it seems to me like that there may be a need that like that. And I don't know how to fit that into our notions.
I'm going to ask you to hold that thought, but the teaser is I'm going to propose that things that are deprecated go into the historical bucket, whether you call it historical or deprecated.
So yeah, this is essentially allocate to historical. Right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So hold that because just okay. Now that I teaser, the legacy instructions that's for legacy packet access instructions in BPF are already listed as deprecated, right? And so I'm saying those opcodes get registered as historical. That's an example. And you're saying, what would the next thing be, right? So,
Thanks, Tolos. Go ahead.
Yes, I'm not sure if this needs to stay this statically divided. So let's say we have the traditional old, numeric opcode. We divide the space up into the different things, but then people bring in what starts to be experimental, right? They take it from the provisional, whatever we call the bucket, right? And it has a lightweight approval process. But at some point in time, we go back and say, hey, we want to make this part of the whatever revision 19 of the mandatory set of instruction opcodes, right? I don't see any reason of not having in the registry a particular column that upgrades them to basically permanent at that point in time, so that we don't need to change the opcode numbers.
That's
right?
exactly how URI schemes work. Yeah. What you just said is exactly what happens for URI schemes. So when something upgrades from provisional to permanent, it just gets a label change.
Right.
Christoph, did you want to say something, or you're hanging out in case you want to say something?
I was going to say something, but I think Dave already.
All right. Let's go on to the next slide here, so we can. So here I've been talking about URI schemes. It's just a precedent to say, yeah. Because I was the author of the document that documented the existing process. Not that I created it, but I wrote the document that documented what people were doing in the process. So for URI schemes. Okay, so here's what I proposed in the list to say we have historical, permanent, provisional. Pick your favorite names, but I just copied the names from the previous one. And so for historical, meaning deprecated things, I'm proposing specification required. And that starts being the set of things that are listed as deprecated in the instruction set RST right now, which is just the legacy BPF packet access instructions. There could be other things that get deprecated over time, but that starts in that category. For permanent allocation, I propose standards action. Okay, that means it's a standards track RFC, not just an RFC, but a standards track RFC. So that's like one of the most strict ones, right? IETF standards track RFC, and that would be true for everything else currently in instruction set.rst. Right, that's my strawman proposal. Provisional would be specification required. So again, if you're not familiar with specification required, right, which is historical and provisional. The way that works is it's a superset of expert reviews. So specification required. The IESG designates one or more designated experts. Okay. Typically, it might do that by asking the working group chairs and authors of the document to recommend some, and then they'll select one or more people that would be designated experts. And so what happens is if somebody else wants an allocation, specification required means they're required to have a specification. Doesn't have to be an RFC, doesn't have to be in a net draft. Okay, as long as they're a stable document that you can point to. You then send that to someplace that the IANA consideration section says to send it to. For some of them, it might say send it to IANA. Other ones, it might say send it to a particular mailing list, like URI review, okay, as an example. Once it does that, then IANA will notice it and ping the designated expert saying, can you tell me whether to allocate this thing or not, okay? And so within specification required, there's still a wide variety of what the expert does and who gets to review it. Even within the policies, you get to write the rules for who you want to review it, who the designated expert can ask, and whether it has to go to a mailing list or not. That's still within specification required, or even still within expert review, right? I think there's somebody from IANA is in the room, so tell me if I'm getting it wrong, but I'm a designated expert on a couple of registries. So here, specification required, and we say what the rules is, like you have to send it to the cross-posted the mailing list, and then the designated expert gets it. We write that in the text, okay? But the high level, those are the buckets that I would propose is 3 categories, historical, permanent, provisional. And so if somebody comes along and says, I first want to do some new instructions. I don't want it to be standardized initially. I want to implement it and check it in right now and start using it, okay? Then they go through the provisional path. They write a spec. They go through submitting it to whatever the right mailing list is. The designated expert looks at it and says, yes, Anna, it's fine to list this in the registry as provisional, and here's the pointer to the spec. And then it shows up on the page as being, here's the pointer to that spec, and this code point has been allocated so somebody else can't grab it, okay? And then at some later point, you want to put it in RFC. So then you come back and you say, I want to upgrade this from provisional to permanent. Now I actually have to go to the IETF, create an extension document, right? Not an obsolete document, but create an extension standalone document that says, here's the set of extensions. Maybe it's one instruction, maybe it's a set of 10 of them, whatever it is. Here's the behavior of it. I put that in the working group or some working group, this one or another working group in the future, right? If it's 10 years from now. And then that gets standardized, and then it flips from provisional to permanent. Okay, it's kind of how that process would work. So that's my straw man that I posted the list. Happy to take feedback or whatever. I think I had another slide that's going to walk through an example or so, but this is the main proposal, is this slide right here. Okay, go ahead and go on to the next one. Okay, so now we got two options for what the registry, that the entry in the registry might look like. Okay. So assuming it's an IANA registry, then you got two ways for what the IANA registry or registries would look like. So here's option one. Before I get into this, Chris, did you have a comment on the previous slide?
So the problem with standards track, right, is that when the working group closes, then you're kind of SOL, right?
No, you can still get standards track RFCs after the working group closes.
Well, you can't do it through ISE.
Correct. You have to do it through some IETF process,
either AD sponsored or some other working group. And
correct.
That's generally a significantly higher bar than having a working group.
So let's take an example. We're going to take an existing example, right? Because you do the analogy, 5 years from now. So let's say the NFS working group wanted to have BPF instructions for NVMe, and let's say the BPF working group had already closed. Okay, the NFS working group could do it in that working group. Okay, with review by the same mailing list and the same designated experts, but not in this working group. It's in an existing working group that's instructions for that working group. You could.
I guess I just, previous experiences, expert review is my personal experience preferred, right? Because then, some set of folks who were involved in the working group and that can kind of continue, right?
So I hear you arguing, if you go back a slide, Suresh or David, who has got it, I hear you arguing that you want permanent to flip back and also say specification required.
That was my personal preference for those reasons. I mean, it is a barrier. We've heard it before on kind of with SACM in particular, and some.
Because there's things in between those two. So if you go back to the menu of options here, RFC required is in between those. So keep going. Yeah, that one right there. You can see in between specification required and standards action is RFC required. That means you can go to the ISE.
Right, but the problem with IFC or ISE.
No, I'm not in favor of that. I'm saying, are you?
So. No, I'm not.
Okay,
because that's pretty much going to allow informational RFCs to be sufficient, which is actually a much lower bar than expert review, in my opinion.
IETF review, the main difference between IETF review and standards action is that IETF review can be an informational RFC in the IETF, where a standards action is only a proposed standards RFC. IETF review still means it's an IETF RFC. It's just not necessarily standards track.
Yeah, so I did have something to talk about here, right? Like there's another thing kind of like from what we desire. There's other thing is about the scarcity of the code point itself, right? Like the less the number of bits, usually we go higher up the difficulty chain. That's like one thing, and the rate at which they're consumed. So if you look at like ports, for example, like getting a TCP port or UDP port was like, hey, dude, can I have a port? And it's like, yeah, to now you probably have to jump through like hoops on fire to get one, right? So I think like, I think that's another thing. It's not relevant to like what we want, but like how scarce the space is that is getting allocated. So that also plays into the picture. And so I could see going either way on this, like, but I think that's an additional consideration I want like the working group to think of.
Yeah, I get the desire for standard. I mean, I see it. I'm just worried about it's exactly the 5 years down the road problem. Whereas expert review, as long as the experts are reasonably responsible and sane, it they can manage it intelligently, what the sparseness is, what the allocation is, etc., without necessarily having to find. ADs are, my experience, not super excited to do, a lot of sponsors, etc. That's my piece.
All right. Agree. Thank you. Yari, go ahead.
Yark. So first off, I like your proposal, Dave. I think it's quite reasonable. I am personally maybe also a little bit like wondering sometimes, not just in this case, but in general, that are the INR rules that we're setting too hard? It's if you don't have a running out of space problem, then making it a little bit more relaxed can be helpful. And I'll offer you one way of making that relaxation that I've used in previous documents. So in previous documents, we had something like standards action or some such. I would accompany that with or ISG approval, so that there's some set of people that can grant an exemption and nobody has to break any rules. And it could be expert review as well, but ISG is default route for questions.
I see a thumbs up from Chris, just noting that for the minutes, and I like that idea too, personally. So,
well, I'd like to make the argument for RFC required, because that also doesn't allow you to go to ISE. For example, as long as the working group is there, any working group that says, well, we feel responsible for these things, right? So please come to us.
Sorry, can you repeat the parody of that one? I'm not sure I got the parody right. Did you say
as long as there is a working group that feels it is entitled to do something about the topic, whether that's the BPF now or later any other working group to which we offload this stuff when we close this one, right? As long as there is this working group, RFC required will basically say somebody goes to the ISE and the ISE says, well, you need to go to this working group, right? So
RFC required means that the independent submission stream is okay. IETF review means that it's not.
I'm saying RFC required doesn't necessarily mean that ISE track is available as long as there's a working group that is responsible for this topic. But if the working group goes away, if no working group wants to take on the job anymore, then one of the ISE track things that needs to be done is to check that there is no working group that wants to take on this work. As long as there is a working group that wants to take on this work, that working group is deciding what they want to do with it, whether they want to do it standardized or even informational. So I think this is the right fallback.
I understand what you're saying as an alternative to what Lars said, that if you write the rules right, you can get that. I have my own opinion, but I see Lars came back to the mic. So
you also said that probably wants to say the same thing. So that's actually not correct, right? So if you go RFC required, the ISE can take it on even if a working group exists. There's then an ISG conflict review where the ISG would probably say, hey, this sort of conflicts with the work going on in the BPF working group. Do you know about that? But the ISE can still choose to publish even if the ISG says do not publish. And that is a situation that I would really like to avoid. So I really actually like the standards action proposal or ISG approval that Yari made for that reason. Thank you.
So then
thank
I would agree.
You and I and Joel are all going to say the same thing. So.
So as long as we basically have preference for a working group that wants to take on the work over ISE, I think we have the right policy. And if the current conflict resolution isn't that policy, then I'm sorry. Then I'm withdrawing the proposal and saying that is the policy that we should have.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. I think like Yari's point kind of gave the release valve with the working group clause. The IESG can either direct to a group that exists or like kind of do the thing themselves. I think that's probably easier for somebody than going to the ISE because the ISE process takes a lot of time, right? Like ISE needs to find like reviewers and stuff and so on. So maybe that's an easier path, which kind of accomplishes everything you want, but maybe slightly lighter, I think.
Okay, last word on this one. Christoph, no, you, Christoph.
Yeah, so I'm probably going to come to a very similar conclusion as before, but as someone who's really just a tiny contributor on the IETF side and is coming from the Linux background, a lot of these internal politics were actually above my head, and maybe I'd like to skin the cat from the kind of existing eBPF and Linux community point of view, right? And I think for us, the important bit is that random people don't define random extensions, but we also don't lock ourselves out of ever extending it again. These are kind of, I think, the two main goals that we want to reach. And I think that one central part of it is expert review, as in like the core eBPF contributors being okay with it, is I think the really, really central point.
Mhm.
And to properly do this, we need a specification. That's, I think, the absolute minimum bar in addition to expert review.
Yeah.
And with my little bit of IETF contribution history, I definitely like the idea of a standards action as like the default path. And I leave it to the people who understand the bureaucracy better than me to figure out what are the important escape valves that we still need in addition to that.
All right, thank you. Let's go back to the slide that has option 1 at the top. So now we're into, once you have a registry and you agree on what the policies are, what does it actually look like? And so here's option number 1, okay? And this is what I was getting at when I said, is it just opcodes or whatever? And the answer is no. Today, including stuff that's in progress, meaning patches that are in the process of being reviewed, a BPF instruction is identified by a tuple of 4 fields, okay? So opcode, source, immediate, and offset being the last one that was added as a tuple that's a discriminator, right? And so any one of those can be wildcarded. So you always have an opcode, and for some opcodes, you may have, here's the source, and for any IMM value, or maybe it has to be 0 and whatever. So you can create a flattened table like this with some wildcards and source, with source and or immediate. And then a particular definition for each of those, and you'd have a spec that references them. And right now, all the spec is instruction set RST, right? So one way is to flatten it to say there's 4 key fields. In order to ask for an allocation, you say I would like this opcode, and here's the source value, or I want it to be wildcarded. Here's the immediate value, or it's wildcarded, and here's the offset value, right? And so you say here's these 4 fields, and then that gets reviewed and it gets added into this. This is option number 1, which is a flat table. Okay. Option number 2. Same kind of information. So you have one table that's the opcode table. And so the thing is, some opcodes have multiple instructions associated with it. And you say, well, here's all the opcodes, and some of those is just defined by the opcode. And everything, and other ones, the same opcode is ambiguous so far. There's multiple instructions. And so for, say, opcode hex 18, they're all 64-bit immediate instructions, but there's a bunch of them. And so you could say, well, I'm just going to put those in a different table. Okay, and so I've got one registry that's the opcode registry, and one registry that's the 64-bit immediate instructions registry. So if I want to have a new 64-bit immediate instruction, I don't need a new opcode. I just need to create an entry in the immediate instructions one and add another, source value as the discriminator there, right? And so this is an example which is hierarchical, right? Because the opcodes being the top level of the hierarchy. And then for some of these, so the next level of the hierarchy down in this, opcode 18, the next level is the source one. And for a different part of the hierarchy, the next level might be the IMM value, right? If you look at like the atomics and so on, the IM value is the next level of the hierarchy. So you can craft it either way. I don't have a preference, but the point is you pick one of these 2 and you write it up this way. And right now in my internet draft, I took option 1, but if people like option 2, I really don't care between those. All right, so. If nobody else cares, then I will keep in the existing work until somebody has a preference. So.
Oh, Watson Lad, I prefer option 2. I think it conveys the structure a lot better than a giant table.
Okay. Thank you for expressing a preference. Somebody doesn't have a preference. All right. I'm happy to switch to option 2 if people, unless there's anybody that objects to option 2 and just hates it, then I'm happy to switch to option 2 in the. Okay. I see Will giving me a 2. Okay. Thank you, Will.
So I agree that the hierarchical representation for the normative part is the right way to do it. And for things like the INA registry, I also think the actual flat table that is basically the reverse mapping that we have in this appendix can be really useful for implementers.
As an implementer, I could do the same thing with either option number 1 or option number 2. For purely selfish reasons, I'd like to not do both.
Well, the good thing is if you have the hierarchical table, you can auto-generate the flat table from it.
Sorry, option 2, you can auto-generate option 1 from 2? Is that what you said? Yeah. Okay. It's easier to auto-generate 1 from 2 than the other way around. Yeah, okay.
Lars, I thinking about the sort of IANA side of this, right? So how many in this option 2 thing, right? You would have a separate table for each line in the first table, right? No?
Each line, so you can say some lines like opcodes hex 17 and 1F, at least today, there's only one instruction there. It allocates the entire opcode space, right? This is putting aside for a second, maybe something could change in the future that takes one and splits it into a new registry. But at least if you look at what's in there today, only a small number of opcodes have multiple values. I think like the byte swap opcode does, the 64-bit immediate one does, the atomic one does. There's like a handful of ones. And so right now we're talking about a total of less than 10 registries total in option 2.
Okay, I was just worried that IANA tooling would explode if we have like
it's more than 2,
2,000
but it's less
tables
than 10.
on a page somewhere. Okay.
Yeah, it's
All
somewhere
right, great.
between 2 and 10 right now. Okay. If IANA has an opinion, that'd be interesting too. But otherwise, it sounds like we're leaning towards option 2 there. Okay. And if anybody else has any comments, the actual literal text that I posted to the list and the strawman table, which still follows option 1, is currently sitting there in that per request. You can go and browse it or whatever. And then I will update it based on the comments that I've heard so far. But otherwise, it matches exactly what was on the list. So, okay.
Tom Herbert. So this is great. I'm just wondering, suppose somebody wanted to add instructions, will there be like guidance on how to do it, what the process is? That would be really helpful, I think.
How to add instructions? Is that what you asked?
Well, no, what I mean is, suppose somebody came in and said, I already have a set of instructions that would be appropriate to put in BPF. It would be really good if there was a document that said, here's generally the process.
Yes.
So there's obviously a lot of moving parts here. We have to deal with IETF. We have to deal with Linux. That document would be really helpful. The other thing, any limitations or constraints that we expect. So I do a lot of work, for instance, in RISC-V, which is an open ISA, have added quite a few instructions. They allow, for instance, custom instructions. So they already give code points, entry points, quite useful. It'd be really good if those sort of things were documented. So in a sense, we want to make it easy to do this, right? And promote this. It's an extensible.
Easy to do it right and hard to do it wrong. So yeah, I think the goal of a good IANA consideration section is to actually give that process. Although one of the audiences of IANA considerations is, of course, IANA itself, and the other audience is a potential person that wants to get an entry in the registry. Although it's not common for, say, IANA consideration sections of an RSC to repeat the definition of the policy, like, expert review, right? They're not going to copy all the text of what an expert review means. It's going to say, here's what an expert should look at, right, in there, but it won't say, here's how expert review works inside IANA or whatever. That's in a different RFC. But if we can somehow say, here's what an allocator person needs to know, I think the IANA consideration section is a good place to put that. So I get your point, and I agree that having it be in this section here would be good. Anything that you can come up with that's not in there right now, send me text or send me ideas. Yeah.
So if you take this to the extreme, right, somebody may come in with a complete set of instructions, not just one or two. They may have a whole subsystem. Obviously, we want to make this process as easy as possible. What we don't want to do is propose something and then just people come back and say this is all messed up, and we get that. So any guidance you can give on this topic would be quite helpful to developers.
If you have suggestions there, then yeah.
So yeah, Christoph Helvig again. So as someone who's only got minor corrections into RISC-V and never any of the actual work I wanted to do, I at least understand how that works very differently than eBPF, right? I mean, if you look at a real CPU instruction set like RISC-V, it's got a much bigger opcode space. It's got a much bigger scope where people want to do. And the scope, what eBPF is kind of designed for, is very limited. So I don't think we need to be quite as inclusive and extensive as RISC-V. That doesn't matter. It wouldn't be good to document the assumptions, but compared to all the other work we have on the plate, I would not consider it a focus for the working group. And I'll try to quote Alexei from memory, and he can shout at me if I misquote him. And a lot of the interesting things about eBPF isn't really the instruction set, but like the whole environment, and we're not even getting to that. So maybe right now we shouldn't spend too much time on actually extending the instruction set. Just really make sure we can, because we absolutely have to. It just really shouldn't be the prime reason.
Yeah, I mean, I think we do have to get the process ironed out and enumerated, because that's what we're going to be building it off from later. But to your point, yeah, we don't need to build too much of that.
So I do have one question if people have a strong opinion on, which I alluded to earlier, and I'll ask it now because I don't have a convenient place to ask it later, right? I mentioned that the INA considerations text right now, the text itself, the INA considerations section is in GitHub, not in the Linux kernel repository. If somebody has a strong opinion as to which is the better place for it, should it move over to the Linux kernel repository or stay in GitHub? I don't care either way. If somebody else has a strong opinion, I'm happy to do that. And so the stuff that I've been presenting here is only in a GitHub pull request right now. That's the top line there. That's my reminder to ask this question here, as opposed to a kernel patch contribution there, even though it's cross-posted to both lists in either case, right? It's the same set of reviewers, right? But which Git repository does the authoritative copy live in for INA considerations? I don't care either way, but if somebody else has a strong opinion, I'm just saying right now it's GitHub because that's what I did, but whatever. Okay. That was the only question that I want to ask before I turn it back to the chairs. So
my not so strong opinion, but is like, I think with this duality of the repositories, as soon as we're in a working group document, never mind a working group like last call, I don't think it really works like that anymore, right? Because then we're tightly in the IETF process and like minor fix-ups, and eventually the document is going to be released and stable. And I suspect the best thing at that point is to just have a static copy of the IETF document in the kernel tree if you really want it there. And the problem kind of goes away, which suggests it probably doesn't matter where we have it right now, because in the long run, it's just going to be in one place anyway.
I take it as you don't care. You have an opinion on the long-term one, and I agree with you on the long-term one. But
Yeah,
the short-term
and
one,
I
it sounds like
don't
you
really care how we get there,
That-
but
that's
in the
my
long
opinion
run,
too.
it's pretty easy, I think.
I don't care in the short term, which is why, because it's going to move eventually. If it moves when it becomes an RFC, that's fine with me. So, okay. All right. Thank you. All right. I'll hand it back to the chairs. Do you want me to stay up here or sit down now?
Yeah, I think you can stay up here. So we do have a deliverable for the ISA, right? And one of the goals to move the working group forward is to have a document that meets the deliverable. And right now, like we have a draft Taylor BPF ISA that seems to be like a good fit for this thing. So we kind of want to do an adoption call. And just for the people who are not involved with the IETF, the adoption of a document, it's not an end point, it's a start point. Like, so that's when we actually start doing the work, right? So there's like, there's probably going to be like hundreds of issues, thousands of issues. I don't know, hopefully hundreds of issues that's going to be there. But like, we do want to have some document with change control that belongs to the working group. Right now, Dave is editing, like Dave can put whatever in there, right? Like, I'm sure Dave doesn't do that, but theoretically, like he has control of the document. He can theoretically put in whatever, but I think the adoption of the document brings the document into working group control. And Dave may or may not be the editor of the document. He may or may not want to be it, but like that's something we can figure out, like, going forward. But the working group takes over the document and appoints an editor for the document. That could be Dave, somebody else, like, we have to figure that out. Or multiple editors of the document, like, based on Dave's proposal. So so the way this kind of works is like we have a meeting. So the kind of idea is to get a sense of the room, but also confirm this on the mailing list after. So like both the our list as well as the Uyghur kernel list, like both of them will get like a note saying, hey, what do you think of this? Do you have issues and stuff and so on? So the idea is this is not voting. The idea is to understand if there's any concerns using this as a starting point. Like usually that happens when there's multiple drafts contending to be the working group document. That's kind of when a lot of the contention happens. There's only like one document in there. So that idea would be like use it as a base and do whatever work we need to do on top of that, right? So the way we usually do it is by humming. So the idea is like we can either do hands or humming, but humming is kind of better because it allows people to express their opinion more freely. Like it's more of a cultural artifact than anything that's like required, but that's kind of how we do it. So the first question I have is like, how many people have actually read this document? It's like linked in the materials, the draft Taylor BPF ISA. If I can hear a hum for people who actually read it.
If you've read instruction set RST, you've read 99% of the document.
Yeah. So yeah, go ahead. Okay, go for it. Raise hands is good. Go for it. Okay. Yari's read half the document. Okay, so reasonable number of hands. Okay, so like trying to do an adoption call for this. How many people think this would be a good starting point for a working group document for the ISA deliverable? So if you think you support that, hum now. If you think this is not a good starting point for the ISA document, please hum. Okay, I don't hear anything against. So the next step is like, since we have a meeting, we do this just to get a sense of the room. So since the sense of the room is to adopt it, like the actual adoption happens on the mailing list. So like this is not a final decision, just like a way to start the adoption call on the mailing list. And a couple of things we need more than this is to get reviewers for the document. So like from the IETF side, if you're interested in reviewing the document, please raise your hand. Okay, couple of hands. Thank you. Thank you. And if you are willing to edit this document, so become an editor of the document, just send a note to the chairs, either after the meeting, anytime. If you're interested, just send us a note, and we'll certainly choose the editors for the document based on who's available. Thank you. So next step is we will do adoption column list. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Dave. So next up, I believe Will's going to be talking about ABI considerations.
Hello, everyone. My name is Will Hawkins. I'm a professor of computer science, but we'll get to that in a second. First things first, I wanted to let you know I chose the most obnoxious Microsoft theme I could possibly find for this presentation. So that I went out of my way to do that. I think I succeeded. So you can go to the next slide. I think you skipped the overviews. Or did you go 2 instead of 1?
This is the second one.
Okay. We'll start with this. What is an ABI? Well, everyone knows what an ABI is, right? It's obvious. Next slide.
Sorry, we're just going to make sure that we have the right
fine.
presentation. Just one
Okay.
second.
That's fine.
Okay.
So you can go to the third slide.
All right.
There you go. So no, it's not obvious. I spent a long time trying to find a good definition published somewhere for what an ABI is. There's a lot of documents that say, okay, ABI this, ABI that, but none of them say like a really good definition. So I started by attempting to come up with this definition, and an application binary interface defines the requirements that one or more binary software objects must meet in order to guarantee that they can interoperate and or use the resources provided by operating system / hardware combinations. So we started with that. So with that general premise in mind of what an ABI is, I want to talk a little bit about what the goal is for having an eBPF ABI. I'd like to say a little bit about who am I and why am I qualified to do this. Spoiler alert, I'm not. I'd like to talk a little bit about the early effort and how we can collaborate on this, and then how we can go forward and maybe make something out of this. So go ahead. So the goal here, I believe, would be to create something that looks a lot like the generic ABI for System 5, but for eBPF. We would have support in that for processor-specific supplements for different implementations. So there might be a processor-specific ABI for the kernel, for Windows, for FreeBSD, or for some hardware implementation of this, like the, I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, Agilio CX. If anyone wants to give me one of those to play with, more than happy to take it. So, like I said, the scenario would resemble something like the setup for the System 5 ABI. In fact, in an attempt to make it as close to the System 5 ABI setup as possible. The straw implementation that I have out there now, or the straw collaboration point, is named System AD ABI, and that's for Alexi and Daniel. So that's System AD. So we have the System AD ABI that we're going to describe. So
Nice.
okay. So who am I and why am I qualified? I gave you my name already. I'm Will Hawkins. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of Cincinnati. And I am definitely not qualified to do this. I am only qualified insofar as I love obscure things that are heavy on the details. And I am a co-maintainer with Alan Jowett of Microsoft on the UBPF implementation of eBPF. So huge fan of all the work that's already been done on eBPF. I think I was actually talking to a friend of mine on the phone last night. He said, "What are you doing out there at that IETF thing? It sounds like a boondoggle where you get to go hang out in San Francisco." I was like, "Oh, don't worry, it is." But in all seriousness, I get to talk about eBPF, which I think is one of the most influential technologies that we've had recently in terms of being able to really do things in the kernel a little more quickly than we have in the past. And I think that's really, really impressive. And so I'm really thank you to the chairs for letting me stand up here and talk today. So that said, I am an incredible shrinking violet with an incredible thin skin. So again, I'm not an expert on any of this. I'm just trying to facilitate a process to get something that I think needs to be done. So please treat me kindly if you don't mind. So given what we've already talked about in this session, I think a lot of what is on this slide is pretty much OBE based on what we've talked about. But I will say that the early efforts are online at this GitHub URL. And the current text has been scraped together in a few weeks. But I think the parts that are a good start are the definitions section and the introduction. And I would like to get to a point where we agree on the rough structure of the contents of the document and then follow all the rest of the processes that we've laid out here to get it going into the right spots, into the right document locations. So the open question, we've already discussed the open question extensively, whether or not this is the right spot to collaborate. It sounds like it's not. So I will work after the meeting with the chairs and with everyone else in the room to get it into the right spot so that there's a way to collaborate and make those collaboration efforts available to everyone. So I think that's pretty much all the slides that I had. Again, I would love to hear any feedback that people have. And if anyone wants to collaborate, please let me know.
Christoph?
Yeah, so I was a little tripped off by you mentioning like different ABIs for Linux and FreeBSD and whatever, because I think for a lot of the users that one of the interesting use cases is that if you have a program type supported by different environments, it really should be portable between these environments. And I know Dave really likes to be able to say use Linux eBPF programs written for Linux on Windows and vice versa. And then I took a brief 30-second look at your document after you posted the link, and I actually think the document is doing the right thing. It was just a slightly tripped me off.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure there's a lot of fine points we need to do in that document, like not actually talk about syscalls like the sys5 ABI does, because the concept is slightly different. But I actually think the whole structure translates very well. And yes, it will be a fair amount of work, but I think it's very useful work, and we probably need to tie it a lot to different program types and stuff, but it's a good start. It's going to be a lot of work, and it's probably something we as the group here should eventually look into. I also suspect for many here, it's not the first priority. We really want to get that instruction set document out as soon as possible, including the extensibility, but it's definitely good and important work.
Thank you for the feedback. And I definitely, we talked a little bit about this before the session this morning. I definitely agree with you that the ISA is definitely the place to start. Yep. So thank you for the comments.
Just to quickly chime in, yeah, it's ISA is definitely the priority, but of course, nothing is stopping us from concurrently working on both. But yeah, exactly. But we do have to avoid the dependency on the PSABI doc for that. Dave?
Dave Thaler. First of all, thank you, Will, for being willing to take this on. I appreciate that. On the ISA document, I think some of the discussion on the ISA document is that there are some things that are in the ISA document right now that I've heard arguments from people like Alexi that they should move out of the ISA document and into the ABI document. And so having a start on this one is important for us to be able to close on the ISA document. Okay, so that we have a place to move text to without the text being lost. Okay, and so that's why I think that this is really good to say adopt something, even if it's a skeleton that has almost no content in it, so that when we move stuff out of the ISA document, so we can close it down, that we have a place to put it, right? And so things like, how many registers are there and so on. So just like, so my view of the slide that you talked about, where there's, different instantiations or whatever, I think that the document that I'm hoping that you might be proposing to be an editor of is one that might say, here's a set of minimum bar, right? You must have, at least, 11 registers, R0 through R10, and you must, whatever that, you must have at least 512 bytes of stack space, whatever it is, right? So you come up with things like that, that there's text in the instruction set RST right now that should move over because they're not about the instructions per se. And then anything that's else that says, let's say you have a platform that has, 12, 15 registers or whatever. Is it compliant or not? Well, it does. It has all these things, but you can't write a program that's going to run on these other platforms too, but you're still compliant to the instruction set, right? So this is the document to cover those things. And so that's what I see as being value in here, and saying if somebody wants to have, a superset of it that says, yeah, we happen to have, a meg of stack space or something like that on our platform. Yeah, you're still compliant. Where would you put that down? You don't put that down in the common document. You put that down in your platform specific extension. So I'm a fan of all that type of approach, but I think there's super value in this. And I think it's time critical because I think it's necessary to get a start, because it's necessary for us to close down the ISA doc.
Thank you very much. Am I allowed to?
Yeah.
Okay. So no, I think that's really great. And I think especially, I wanted to make 2 points on that. One is in the document text right now, it even explicitly says, look, in your processor specific sections, or in the generic part where we say a processor specific must define this or must give a value for this, it's setting only a minimum. Those can go above that. Like, okay, look, you must have 512 stack space. Well, the processor specific ABI may say you can have a gig or whatever. Okay. And then the other quick question I think that maybe goes back to the ISA document is there were some specific spots in the ISA document that we wanted to take out. Do we actually want to do that, or are we okay leaving them in there because they're in there now? Like specifically reflecting on, I think, Alexi, you said that you would prefer not to have the calling convention in the ISA document where it is now. I've already duplicated that section in the ABI. So if we want to just take it out of the ISA document, maybe we can do that.
So yeah, that was one thing. Like the calling conventions, like the register usage, is definitely in ABI and not instruction set thing. One thing where I tend to pretty strongly disagree with what Dave said earlier is the number of registers is actually a very fundamental part of the instruction set. And there are a bunch of weirdo instruction sets that actually have options for different numbers of registers. x86 is actually going there with the newest Intel extension, but even that needs to be an option in the instruction set and not just in the PSABI, because you're running into all these encoding problems otherwise.
Yeah.
But the actual usage of the registers for calling conventions, yes, that's absolutely ABI.
And actually, yeah, that's a great point. And actually, Alexi made a good point about that too, where we could have R10 is the register base is a base pointer in some instances or not. So yeah, great point. Thank you.
And to go back to your earlier question, and I think Alex already said it, but yes, we need to take it out of the instruction set document, the calling conventions. And as Dave said, we need a place to record it. So we need to figure out if we want to start with your quite, well, comprehensive, at least in structure document, or just have a little notes document for now, but we need a place to record it. I think that we can drop it from the instruction set document, preferably something that's also in the Linux kernel tree right now, at least as long as there's no comprehensive set of bigger specifications to replace it, which might argue against just doing a newer document, because I think in the current form, it's not really something for the kernel tree. But I mean, those are minor details. We don't need to waste the working group time to discuss it.
100% agree. That's in the only reason I feel a little sheepish having like this GitHub repo even on this slide, because it's not what I want. I want it to be part of what everyone else is doing, but I also didn't feel like it was to the point where it would even like, it could be even checked into that standardization
I mean, we
folder,
can get
so.
philosophical, but nothing gets done unless someone starts it, and anything that's committed to version control is a good start.
So if there is a consensus that we want to move what's in this repo after, you know, another week of my work with just cleaning up things that say to do and things like that into that standardization folder, I'm more than happy to do that. Just, you know, give me the word and we'll do it.
Yeah, I think the natural progression would be clean up whatever you want, and then we'll send it to the list, and people can take a look.
Okay.
And you know, given that if we're going to model it after the charter item for building compatible binaries, it already kind of has a fit there. And so if it's in a skeleton form, if it's quite basic, it should hopefully be minimally contentious.
Okay.
Cool. Thanks a lot, Phil. And thanks for willing to step up and come talk here. Like, we love newcomers here, and like, you know, coming in and just doing this, like, really appreciate you coming to do and your help, your offer to help as well. So thank you.
Well, I'm really excited. Thank you for letting me speak. And now I'm going to be incredibly rude and go to the conflicting session that I was supposed to be at. And so it's going to look like I don't want to be here anymore.
Sounds good.
but
As long as you started here, that's all that matters.
Oh, I definitely started here. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dave? Paging Dave Taylor.
Yeah, so we're just having a discussion. The tool that I have that generates internet draft format from RST files should work with, in theory, any RST file. And if it doesn't, then file an issue, because the tool is open source. So we can file issues and fix bugs for a transform tool. So yeah, any other documents that come up, whether it's a PS API or the document that I'm going to talk about next or anything else, use that as their, because you're pulling up the ELF one. I'm
trying.
Okay.
Yeah, it's on.
So this one is also an internet draft that is also generated from RST using the same tool. That's why the generator tool is not a BPF repository. It's an RST to, you know, ID repository. Just like a bunch of other tools at IETF.
It was added too late. Yeah, I think it was unfortunately added too late to data tracker. But yeah.
All right, in that case, meeting closed. I figure if we have spare time, then I can talk about this one. This one is less important or urgent anywhere in the timeline, is because it's sequenced after the other ones. But if we have spare time, then I can talk about it, since there actually is an internet draft with the number of open questions.
Do you have Chrome?
Yeah.
Open the thing in a new tab and you can share the tab.
Okay.
The chairs have it up on their screens, right? But it's not up on.
Yeah. Open it in the tab.
Screen.
Okay. Yeah, go for it. Yeah. He had to get out and get in again, I guess.
Let's see if this works. Yay.
Yay.
Okay, there we go. All right.
Is that close enough for
It is close enough. Yeah, let's go. So you just go on to the next slide. So yeah, this one is draft failure BPF ELF. Oh, interesting. You're gonna have to keep it on the same screen. All right. So the working group charter says this, notably. Our working group charter, among other things, says we're going to do two things. And by the way, PS means proposed standard, and I in brackets means informational. says we're going to do one document that's a proposed standard that's on the BPF type format, and one that's on informational. There's documents that recommend conventions and guidelines for producing portable BPF program binaries. Okay, and so notably, the document that I'm going to talk about is in that second category, where ELF is the file format that's the recommended convention guideline for a portable BPF program binary. And notice this is intended as informational, not proposed standard. So keep that in mind, because BTF, right, BPF type format, that one is proposed standard. What I'm going to talk about is informational. And I'm going to ask a question later about is text in the right place, keeping in mind that proposed standard versus informational is a statement about text. And so that depends on which document it goes in, right? Proposed standard text goes in a proposed standard document. Unproposed standard text can go in an informational document. All right, keep that in mind. Next. Okay, so what is ELF? So this one, yeah, go back there. Is there? All right, here we go. Let's see if you can get that on the screen at the same time.
I don't think I can.
Okay, well, I'll talk about it. And in that case, make sure I can see one of your slides. All right, so ELF is a file format. If you're not familiar with it, probably most people are, but just in case there's somebody here that's new to ELF, okay? ELF is not BPF specific, right? ELF has been around since at least the 90s, and there are two versions of the specification that are roughly the same. So one version that you point to, which is the one the draft currently points to as a normative reference, is in the SCO document that's a System 5 ABI, and that one was last updated in 1997. Okay. And then there's the tool interface standard dated 1993, and that one's published by the Linux Foundation. And most of the content is identical, but not everything, and I'll mention that in a second here. So those are the two references. One is SCO, one is Linux Foundation as the maintaining organizations. But you notice that both of those really predate eBPF as it exists today. Okay. ELF file format is used across the industry. The ELF file format is not just used by System 5 or Linux, right? So even though it's SCO and Linux Foundation, it's not Linux specific format, right? We use ELF file formats on eBPF for Windows, for example, and plenty of other things use it, right? So it's just the original reference and the publication place that it originally happened, but then it kind of spanned beyond the original Linux and System 5 and SCO ecosystems and so on. And so this file format supports many different architectures, which they call machines. And so different processor types, for example, are different machine values. That's just the name that's used in that document. Okay. And so what BPF does is BPF uses a profile, or at least what I call a profile, of the general ELF format. And so the general ELF format says, here's a machine field with a bunch of, code point values in it that mean different things, RISC-V and x86 and blah, blah, blah for some other ones. And so BPF is just another one in that set. Okay. So next slide.
We're going to try to change to the other version of sharing, because apparently we've gotten that figured out.
Because the question often comes up, is this, changing the ELF spec or something like that? So no, the ELF spec defines a code point space and a set of general things, and it conforms to all of those. It just allocates another code point value out of an existing registry, okay? And then defines what the meaning is of the other sections that conform to that. So, all right, here we go. Thank you. So the machine value, right, there's a code space that's defining the other ones, and BPF uses the value 247. Now, as I mentioned, eBPF postdates the specifications, right? They were last touched in 1997. So if you look at one of those, they don't define like an IANA registry, right? The only list of the values is in those documents as far as they're concerned, right? So you look at the 1993 spec, and there's only like 16 entries in it. And you look at the 1997 spec over at the SCO repository, and it goes all the way up to like RISC-V and stops at like 243. And so in that sense, BPF is not in either of those specifications, right? Because it postdates them. Okay. So the only thing that you might need to do is figure out, how do I make sure that 247 is allocated via the right mechanism? And here's the spec for it, right? So think about when we talked about allocating, an IANA registry. Well, this is not an IANA thing because somebody else, System 5 generated this. How do we make sure that number 247 gets registered in the right place? My personal belief is that registering the value in the right place is orthogonal to where the specification resides for what 247 means. Okay, so when I say it's a profile that assumes that 247 is the okay right value to use. Okay, that's been taken care of via whatever the other process is. And then here's the spec that you submit that says here's the spec for what 247 means. Okay, that's what this is. And my claim is that IETF is a perfectly fine place to do that, but that's my opinion. Okay, that's what the working group gets to decide as to whether this meets that informational document bullet for our charter. Okay, all right. So what does the profile do? What does the document do? Okay. Well, first of all, it says the value 247 is kind of the discriminator. That's what this document is saying. It says, what's the meaning when I say machine equals 247? What does that mean in the file? This is what defines the rest of that. Okay, but it doesn't contradict anything else in the ELF spec, right? It says, here's how to use it in ways that for what, you know, to constrain what you can do. So for example, in the main ELF specification, there's other ELF header fields that have different possible values. There's different type values. There's different, you know, class values and so on. It says which of the one or ones, in this case one, which value is it that's used by BPF, right? So here's the type value that you filled this into the section header. Out of the menu of options in the main spec, here's the one that you use for BPF. And for the class, here's the one that you use. They're all 64-bit and so on. Okay. Says, what is the meaning of a text section? What's the meaning of a data section? Well, you put your BPF programs into text sections, you put map definitions into data sections, things like that. And then it has some discussion around section naming conventions. As we'll see on a later slide, there's multiple conventions in use today. And it defines contents as some other special, you know, optional sections, you know, version license and so on. So I have later slides in each of these. So this is kind of eBPF profile in one slide. This is what's in there. Okay, your table of contents, if you will. So next. Okay, so now this one is probably the slide with the highest danger of being contentious because I don't know what the answer is. Okay, so here's the question. Okay, so I mentioned there's this relationship to the BTF. So in the Linux kernel repository right now, there's two files. There's btf.rst and there's elf.rst. Okay, and so if I look inside those, elf.rst contains things that are not really about BTF. It's just, you know, ELF profile information. So most of the stuff I've talked about, that's like what goes in the header and things like that, is either not in there, but it's in my internet draft version because it hasn't been merged upstream, or it's the type of stuff that I talked about before, unrelated to BTF. BTF.rst has a bunch of BTF, you know, type format stuff that isn't specific to ELF, but then there's a section that's titled ELF file format interface. So you have elf.rst and you have ELF file format interface in separate files. Okay. And so currently the internet draft, my derivation, okay, takes, whether this is right or wrong, I'm interested in feedback, okay, but my document right now, the internet draft version, takes all of elf.rst, and it takes section 4 out of the BTF.rst, and it puts them in the same document because they're both about an ELF profile, at least that was my thinking, and then it wraps it in some boilerplate, and then I made some other changes to fill in gaps that weren't in either place, okay, and so those things need to be upstream, right? So yeah, got to do that. And so here the real question is, you know, the BTF.rst should be, in my opinion, the thing for which the proposed standard gets derived, right? We haven't done an adoption call, but that's my opinion, is that internet draft should be derived from BTF.rst, you know, that should be the starting point, and that should match that proposed standard bullet, okay? And then stuff that is coming out of, say, elf.rst is what goes in the informational document. So now you can go back and you can say, okay, well, a section 4 ELF file format interface, should that be proposed standard or not? And if you think it should be proposed standard, it should stay in BTF.rst. If you think that, no, that's really informational stuff and it's about ELF, then it should move over into a different file. That's the one that I don't know what the right answer is. So I thought I'd ask here because I took a straw man. I said, well, let's pretend that I'm going to move it and throw up an internet draft and see what people say, right? People can throw tomatoes at it or people can say, yeah, this is the right direction. I don't know. So that's my real question to say, because, you know, I don't know what to do with this yet. I don't know what to do with the upstream stuff. If I were to submit patches upstream, what approach should I take? Should it move out of there because it's informational? Should it stay in there because it has to be proposed standard? And so later slides is actually about the content. This one is about, you know, process and, you know, organization of stuff. Which document does content go in, right? But I'll cover the details of what's in here in later slides.
Yeah, Christoph Helwig again. So I think what you're doing is roughly the right thing, but as I always do for difficult questions, I think we should take one step back and look at the broad ratio, right? And the BTF definitions definitely shouldn't be in the same document with the ELF sections they are customary embedded into with the current Linux tooling. So I suspect you're actually better off A, splitting this, and B, probably like prioritizing the BTF document because whatever embeds it is probably going to depend on it. But the whole like ELF description thing also kind of loops back into the previous ABI discussion that Will brought up, because when people talk about like the ELF format or the PS ABI, there's a bunch of things of different maturity that are getting mixed up, and there's some things that are very, very stable, and in that form in IETF would be standards track, like the register calling conventions, like the section names for basic text and data as in every normal computer program. And these are like completely stable, completely standards tracked by any means, and that's kind of like the fundamental API. And then you have like random magic help elf sections that people are using to optimize some workloads or do cute little tricks. And these are things like, where do I put BTF info? Where do I put eBPF maps? And those really are conventions, right? They're not really fundamental. I mean, if you change all your tools and your loader, you could use anything for it, but it really helps if people agree on something. So the answer might be, what you're doing is right, but not enough.
Okay, that's fair answer. Yeah, so even if there isn't, okay, so I can talk about what I'm incented to do as an implementer, okay, which may be different from my IETF hat, because I have two hats here, right? As an implementer on one side, and as a document IETF participant, editor, and stuff on the other side. I reserve the right to have two different opinions between the two hats, but right now I don't. Okay. I think even an informational document is helpful because I want multiple tools to be able to use to author and multiple things to be able to use to consume, right? Because I care about both Linux and Windows and the runtime side, and I care about multiple compilers, Clang and GCC, and maybe a Rust compiler in the future that would be great on their side. And I want them to talk to each other with a common, minimal set of interoperability stuff, right? I want to have the same tools be usable on Windows and Linux and anything else. And so I'm incented to say that there should be some document there. Informational is fine for that purpose, right? Because from an implementer, I don't care whether it's proposed standard or informational, as long as it's well documented, I can implement off of it, right? So that meets that. And as far as BTF.RST, I'm sure hoping that somebody else will step up, just like Will stepped up on the ABI one. If somebody else steps up to be the editor of like BTF, I would love that. I wasn't volunteering to do that. On the Windows implementation hat aside here for just a second, since I'm one of the people in that project. That's not the only project that I'm on, but from that perspective, it already has implementation of ELF, but not BTF. The BTF one is actually in progress right now. Some parts are implemented, some parts are not yet. It's like right in the middle of it. And so that means that Windows needed the ELF one first, and that's why I stepped up to do the ELF document first to say that's what actually we were trying to implement off of. And now we're trying to do the BTF one as well. And not me personally, but other people are. And so I would love somebody else to be the editor of that one. But I agree with you on, this is in response to you, Christoph, saying the BTF one is actually more urgent. Sure, because yes, that's true. The ELF one has to normatively reference the BTF one. So that part is true, right? That's why they're sequenced that way, right? But you should be able to have an implementation of ELF that doesn't have to have BTF. Only because that's what we did. That's the desirable state, but that's the sequence that we were implemented in. All right. Anyway,
just one thing I just want to quickly chime in to say here. Yeah. I think we should be cognizant to say that it's probably unlikely that we're going to have like an ABI.RST doc and an ELF.RST doc. I think the salient point is that we want to have like, how do you make an informational document on how do you make programs interoperable across platform, which applies to ELF, it applies to BTF, it applies to ABI, right? So I think I expect this isn't going to be the last thing. Like when we talk about standardizing map types, like we're not going to be talking about where to put them, right? We're going to be talking about this is an array map type and that's a hash map type. So I expect that longer term, there's going to be a lot of content going into this like cross-platform interoperability document, I think, because it's touching a lot of different parts of the ecosystem, right?
So you're arguing to combine a lot of stuff into the same RFC?
I'm arguing that for things that this all sounds to me like ELF.RST and the stuff that Will was talking about, that sounds to me like it's an interoperability question, right?
My opinion is that having multiple documents for roughly orthogonal things that reference each other is easier in the timeline because you don't have to hold the first one to the last one. And if you ever needed to obsolete something or file errata, it's on a more granular basis that you can obsolete and replace one of them if you got something wrong without having to touch the other ones. So that's why I like having a division that roughly matches the set of .RST files that exist right now.
Yeah, but you're going to have Sure, that's a possibility. It just seems odd that you would have like that one talks about ABI compatibility, and this one is ELF compatibility, and this one is map
Yes.
compatibility, right? Like
Yeah.
they're all actually have the same goal, but just
Yeah.
want to point I just want to point that out specifically because the charter also has that as
The working group can decide either one, right? Then the charter doesn't constrain how many documents there are. You could take every single one of those and combine all 8 of those bullets into a single RFC. I would not be think that would be the most efficient way to work as a working group, but the working group can choose to do that, or it can take a single bullet and say we're going to take that one bullet and have 5 different documents that are different pieces of that one. That's up to us to decide. And so if the chairs have an opinion or you want us to do something, that's fine. So, all right. So I want to get onto the technical stuff, but if you have guidance, feel free. So Christoph, I don't know if you have a different
Yeah, I mean, the interesting point about splitting and not splitting things would also be is like, are there use cases to use it standalone without the rest, right? And there were at least experimental eBPF implementations that were actually not in the implementation using ELF, usually by stripping the ELF information out earlier, but whatever. So having BTF without ELF conceptually in terms of implementations totally makes sense.
And I will argue vice versa is also possible.
And yeah, there's actually plenty of old stuff that doesn't use BTF. I know Alexei really wants to get away from it because using BTF solves a lot of problems, but that doesn't magically make it appear in places where it isn't right now.
So I think that's a good point of saying units of granularity of what's mandatory. So like you got to implement an ISA.
Yeah. And that gets to my next point, which kind of reiterates what I said the last time I was speaking is, I mean, even just ELF isn't one thing, right? I mean, there is, again, the actual ELF format that a compiler generates and an ELF loader that runs the program needs to understand, which is very basic and fundamental. And then we got all the magic sugar coating on top that usually the compiler doesn't know because it gets inserted by tools or stripped by tools before loading. And that is, to me, a pretty strong but not necessarily required argument that these bits shouldn't sit in the same document.
Okay. Yeah, I'm going to come back to your point because I think I agree with you. Go ahead. Next slide. So I'm going to actually talk about some so now that's mostly not necessarily questions for the working group. It's information to the working group if you're relatively new to BTF or BPF. I'm just going to teach you some things, and hopefully I get the information wrong, because if something is wrong in here, I'm sure somebody will correct me, but this is not a question of the working group. This is statements of current practice that's out there, right? So if you say, when I talk about naming conventions for, I put a BPF program in a text section, what do I name the section? There's just at least 3 different conventions out there in different parts of the BPF ecosystem, right? One convention is that the section name starts with something that identifies the program type, then maybe a slash, and then some other discriminator after that. And so you can look at the section name and you can kind of guess and say, this one is an XDP program or whatever. So that's one convention that's out there and used by some tools. Another convention is that the section name has to exactly be the program type. Like it has to be exactly, XDP and nothing more and nothing less. Okay, that's another convention that's out there. And there's an arbitrary convention that says you can put whatever you want there. The program type is completely orthogonal to that. You don't look at the section name to get program types. That would be silly, right? And so it depends on which tool that you look at as to which convention it is. But these are the 3 popular conventions that's out there. So you can't assume there's a single convention either. But there's at least documents what the 3 conventions are, right? So that you don't think that there's only one. Okay. All right. Next. Data sections. So data sections is typically where people put maps. Okay, there's 2 types of map sections. There's classic maps, meaning before BTF, and then there's the BTF version of maps. Okay, classic sections have a name. Okay, the name is either just plain maps, or in some tools it's maps / some map name, just like there's a program type / stuff. So that's 2 different conventions or whatever. And the contents for the classic ones are specified in at least some version of it is specified in the document right now, and says, well, there may be later versions that add stuff at the end, kind of thing. And then there's BTF maps that uses a dot maps section. Okay. And the maps section is the one that you'd kind of like to deprecate, but there's all kinds of use that's out there. So it's useful to document it for informational purposes, even if it's deprecated, right? Because there's so much use out there. Okay. And BTF maps is the to-do in the document right now in my draft, because that's where there were some gaps that weren't really specified someplace that need to be filled in. And that's the part that would certainly be a normative reference over the BTF document, as we were just talking about. And this is even the text that I pulled out of the BTF document has some gaps that's in there, and that's why there's 2 do's, right? So this stuff wasn't specified in either document right now. It just needs, it's true, but it's missing some details, right?
Joe, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, I guess
hopefully I'm coming through. I was kind of curious about the interaction between this and kind of our current understanding of the implementations that are out there today. Because I feel like there are multiple libraries attempting to converge on similar patterns, and that's I guess in the role of an informational RFC, we could kind of say, well, here's some things that people are doing that are common. And I guess I'm not quite sure the degree to which it's useful to sort of point out, hey, you can do arbitrary whatever you want. And I mean, sure, that's how we started. But I guess how does that interact with this sort of specification?
So right now it's an individual summation, as Suresh is explaining, so I can do whatever I want in an individual summation. And so my opinion and what I started was to say, the job of an informational document is to explain what already exists, right? To not necessarily invent new stuff, but to say, factually, here's what people are already doing. And so if I saw 3 things that were popular out there, I would write them all down. At least having them written down is better than not having them written down. And so if I saw, as long as they're popular, right? If there's somebody's, grad school project, don't care, right? But if there's, libbpf does something, then that should be in here. And if somebody else, it's a major part of the ecosystem, Cilium or whatever does something that's different, that should be in here just because it's such a popular thing, and just state that this is a statement of fact. And so there are major parts of the ecosystem that use each of these conventions. Just like maps, you look at various, .o files that are out there in various repositories and deployments and stuff, and you'll see 3 different types of them. You'll see ones that use maps, ones that use maps/stuff, and ones that use .maps. And we hope that the first 2 are on the downtrend and the third one is on the uptrend, right? But it'll take a while for that to take over as everybody upgrades to latest Linux kernels and things. Windows started by supporting just plain maps, and now it supports all 3, depending on which version you look at. The .maps section was just recently added. But like a year ago, it was just plain maps, just the first of these 3, right? As we've started doing more and more stuff. And so hopefully we want all these to be cross-platform someday, and the first 2 to eventually be deprecated.
So we're out of time. Do you want to take like a quick minute to summarize and do a call for action?
We're out of time? Oh, that's cool. Please review the document. Yeah, go ahead. That's it. Yeah. All right. So I would love to not have it be an individual submission. Either it's adopted or abandoned. And if there's other people want to become co-editors or whatever, that would be awesome. And so I'm just looking for input because I've not updated it between last IETF and this IETF, other than maybe regenerating the internet draft. If I did that, I'm not sure I'd updated references, but there's no textual changes since last IETF, so it's out of date now.
So I think Dave, right? Like what requires discussion is like one document, many document thing requires some like cooking off. Like, so I think let's do it on the list and try to get it done. So
this one would be informational, not proposed standard. So
right, and I don't think we need to wait for the next meeting. So let's try to get it done before like how it goes. So and Christoph, so thank you for your points, and Dave as well. So like let's go on the list and get this done.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you very much, everybody, and thanks for making it an awesome first meeting. And nobody got like hit with stones or tomatoes or everything, so that's a good start. So thank you very much and have a nice day.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks, dude. That's awesome. Good job. Thanks for that.